Welcome back, guys. Trust that you energized. Remember, we're working on cellular respiration. In this segment, we're going to focus on the reactions that take place. Let's unpack those reactions by looking at a flow diagram of all these complex reactions. So guys, it's important that we remember that the stages of anaerobic respiration take place in 3 separate stages. The first step is called glycolysis. I often try and emphasize this by saying glycolysis, and that happens to remind me of what it does. So lysis is splitting up, and glyco refers to the glucose. So try and remember it that way. So this takes place in the cytoplasm. The second stage is called the Krebs cycle, and this takes place inside the mitochondria. So in the cell, we saw that cytoplasm is the one process where it happens called glycolysis, and now we see that inside the mitochondria we have the Krebs cycle. And the third stage is called oxidative phosphorylation, and we'll unpack that in a bit. And this takes place also inside the mitochondria. So there are 3 stages. The first stage happens in the cytoplasm, which is called glycolysis. The next 2, which are the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, take place within the mitochondria. Right, so as we look at this diagram, I'm going to very quickly circle out the different stages. As you see here, glycolysis is indicated with the number 1, and here we have an outer view of the mitochondria, which shows you the second stage called the Krebs cycle, which then in turn supplies products to the third stage called oxidative phosphorylation. And as I mentioned, both of these occur within the mitochondria. So guys, we will look at what is produced in a bit. Let's get straight into looking at this reaction called glycolysis, which is in the cytoplasm. So guys, as I mentioned, glycolysis refers to the splitting up of glucose. So this takes place outside the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell. So as we look at the cell, we know that outside the mitochondria we have the cytoplasm. So we're in the cytoplasm here, and this is where glycolysis is taking place. As I mentioned, it's in the cytoplasm. No oxygen is required during this stage. So it's again a process that does not require the oxygen. The next step of the process is when glucose is broken down. As I mentioned, the word lysis refers to breakdown or splitting. So the glucose is broken or split into smaller molecules, and in that process they release small amounts of energy that is stored in energy-rich ATP molecules. So if we look at that, we can see that energy that is released from the breakdown is then used to produce energy-rich molecules called ATP. At the end of glycolysis, we see the production of pyruvic acid. So the glucose molecules split up into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid then moves into the next stage, which is the Krebs cycle, into the mitochondria, and the energy-rich hydrogen atoms, which are now in the form of ATP, are used in the next steps. Right, so that's glycolysis. We mentioned that the energy-rich hydrogen atoms are then used in the third stage of the process. Let's look at this in a greater detail. So we're seeing that the energy-rich hydrogen atoms then move into the third step, and the 2 pyruvic acid molecules now move into the first step of the Krebs cycle. We must note that at this stage only 2 molecules of ATP are produced. The second stage is called the Krebs cycle. This can only take place if oxygen is present. So we know that oxygen is required for respiration. That oxygen is required in the second stage, which we refer to as the Krebs cycle. So now we see the importance of oxygen coming into play. This occurs inside the mitochondria. This process also releases carbon dioxide and high energy hydrogen atoms. So we look at the energy-rich hydrogen atoms being released, we're seeing that it requires oxygen, and we also know that it produces carbon dioxide as a waste product. So let's read further. Transports hydrogen atoms to the third stage, which we see here, and that goes to the third stage of oxidative phosphorylation. And that happens through an energy carrier enzymes. So we got this hydrogen-rich atoms are carried through by a complex molecule into the next stage. Right, and so we're seeing this further again, moving into the oxidative phosphorylation reaction. Let's look at the third step, which is oxidative phosphorylation. So guys, this takes place again inside the mitochondria and requires oxygen. We see that oxygen is clearly needed for this process. This passes the high energy hydrogen atoms from one hydrogen energy carrier enzyme to the next, and as it does that, it releases energy slowly. So if you look at this, it gradually passes the energy from this in a series of events, releasing water and producing ATP in that reaction. So we find that it uses the released energy, it combines the energy where it takes an adenosine diphosphate and adds a phosphate. And hence we refer to this process as phosphorylation, essentially adding a phosphate to a diphosphate to give you a triphosphate, which is called ATP. And that reaction can be simply illustrated where ADP plus a phosphate gives you this energy-rich molecule called ATP. Okay. The oxygen that is used in this reaction acts as the final hydrogen acceptor. So the oxygen that comes in will now combine with the de-energized hydrogens to form what we refer to as water. So the hydrogen atoms that have given off the energy now combine with oxygen and they form water, which is then released as a waste product during cellular respiration. So again, the importance of oxygen is to combine with the de-energized hydrogen atoms to form water, which is a waste product of cellular respiration. The next concept that we're looking at is anaerobic respiration. If we just step back, we said that this was aerobic respiration where oxygen was needed. It's important that we now look at the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Remember that anaerobic respiration occurs in the absence of oxygen. So again, let's see how that process is different. The key terms is that anaerobic respiration refers to the process occurring in the absence of oxygen. It's also called fermentation. In plants, this type of anaerobic respiration is occurring in yeast and other cells, and we often refer to it as alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation is the breaking down of glucose in the absence of oxygen to give rise to the production of alcohol in plant cells. So we know that this is commercially used in industries in the production of alcohol. So we look at that in a bit. When anaerobic respiration occurs in animal cells, we refer to that as lactic acid fermentation. This is the breaking down of glucose in the absence of oxygen to form lactic acid in animal cells. So guys, the simple analogy for being able to remind you of what happens when you have cramps is the absence of oxygen during cellular respiration. And the buildup of lactic acid is due to insufficient oxygen during cellular respiration. So the body then resorts to carrying out respiration in the absence of oxygen to produce energy. And hence, while producing some energy, it also produces what we refer to as lactic acid. And that is the chemical compound that builds up in muscles, causing the cramping in the different areas. Right. So let's look at anaerobic respiration and where it takes place. Again, as I mentioned, this takes place in the absence of oxygen, so without oxygen. It generally occurs for short periods of time, mainly during physical exercise. And this is again a respiration or a reaction that ensures that some amount of energy is produced when the demands of the body's oxygen are high. This occurs differently in plants and animals to produce less ATP than anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration produces 38 molecules of ATP. However, anaerobic respiration produces only 2 molecules of ATP. And so we see a significant difference. And again, this is a mechanism that ensures that there is some energy produced in the absence of oxygen. Okay, the lactic acid can be converted back into pyruvic acid when the muscles receive oxygen. And so often, if you're exercising after a strenuous workout or a game, we often refer to coaches saying, well, warm down. And warming down essentially means let's continue to inhale and bring in more oxygen into our muscles. And that oxygen then helps to revert back into cellular respiration using oxygen, and therefore converting that lactic acid back into pyruvic acid, which then can be used to produce more energy that is needed in the presence of oxygen. So it's important that when you do exercise that you understand why we experience the stiffening of our muscles, and that when you warm down, it's increasing the oxygen back into your muscles after a strenuous exercise, so that we can prevent the buildup of lactic acid in those muscles. We also know that anaerobic respiration in animal cells, as I mentioned, called lactic acid fermentation, occurs in muscles during intensive exercise. And this enables what we call glycolysis to take place in the cytoplasm in animal cells. As I mentioned, those crystals build up and cause the stiffening and cramp of those muscles as they build up in the cytoplasm of the cell. This results in the accumulation of lactic acid, causing muscle cramps and a lot of discomfort and pain. During this process, only a small amount of ATP is produced. However, this process in plants occurs slightly different. As I mentioned, it's called alcoholic fermentation. And this enables the glycolysis to occur in the cytoplasm of plant cells. And this in turn builds up what we refer to as lactic acid. Let's see what happens to that lactic acid. Let me go back. Sorry. Pyruvic acid. My apologies. This further breaks down the pyruvic acid, forming ethanol, which is then releasing carbon dioxide in that process. This reaction can simply be summarized where we look at glucose being broken down in the absence of oxygen to produce ATP and pyruvic acid. This further is broken down into ethanol and carbon dioxide. And we see this reaction being the release of ethanol, being called alcoholic fermentation. Yeast and other fungi respire anaerobically, and these are used to produce alcohol as beverages in the beer and wine industry. This process is of very importance and significance in the industry where we refer to the brewing of alcohol. Okay, yeast cells are also used in the baking industry where we see that bread is able to rise during the baking process. This is called fermentation, and it's basically able to use in the production of cheese as well. The use of anaerobic respiration in yeast and fungi produces alcohol as well as beer and wine. Yeast cells can be used in the industry during the baking of bread. We also know that we have cheese that is produced as a byproduct of fermentation. So as we wrap this section up, guys, we're looking at the use of anaerobic respiration, which can be used to produce soy sauce, and that is a product which is produced during anaerobic respiration from lactic acid buildup. We also know that lactobacillus can produce cheese during anaerobic respiration, and then Saccharomyces, which would be yeast, is used in the production of ethanol, wine, as well as the baking of bread.